Yes, hello, this is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Chapter 8. Just have a quick recap on what's been going on already then. If you remember the previous two chapters, Chapter 6, we have this new sort of friendship that's resolved between Mr. Utterson and Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Lanyon, if you remember. And Dr. Lanyon and Dr. Jekyll, who'd fallen out over some unscientific balderdash, had become quite good friends again. And then suddenly, in Chapter 6, the remarkable incident of Dr. Lanyon, something happened between the two of them, but Utterson doesn't know what it is, and Lanyon won't tell him what's happened, and Dr. Jekyll won't answer the door to him. When he visits Lanyon, if you remember, he's a man who's very much changed, and he's gone from being a very robust, very strong, very typical Victorian gentleman to suddenly being this very pale, very terrified man. And something's happened. He's been given a great shock somehow, but he won't say what it is. And several days later, he dies. And we then see this very sudden cooling with Dr. Jekyll as well. And it gets to the point where Mr. Utterson is quite relieved, actually, when Dr. Jekyll won't answer the door to him when Paul, the servant, the butler, tells him that he's unavailable. Chapter 7, the incident at the window, if you remember, was the chapter. It's a very short chapter with Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield. And it felt as though we were coming full circle in the sense that the two gentlemen were on their weekly Sunday afternoon walk that took them down the by street where they went in the first chapter, the story of the door. And the two men themselves, if you recall, said there was a sense of kind of finality. They felt that Mr. Hyde had disappeared, that was the last that they'd seen of him, and they had this feeling that things were righting themselves properly again. And if you remember, they walked to the back of the house where the door is, that has the back entrance into Dr. Jekyll's house, into the cabinet where that we associate with Mr. Hyde. And while they're talking, they see Dr. Jekyll at the window, and they try and get him to talk to them, but he won't come down. So they talk to him briefly through the window, and something happens. There is something that they witness through the window that makes Dr. Jekyll kind of hide away in fear and in pain. The two gentlemen don't talk about it, so we as the reader don't know what it is that they saw. Now, whether they saw the transformation into Hyde or whether they just saw this awful look on Dr. Jekyll's face, this look of fear and terror, we don't know what it is. So just bear in mind that the Victorian reader, that this was the first time that they'd have heard of this story or this idea of the transformation, the dual nature of man. They would have been incredibly confused as to what was going on and quite fearful as to what it was that Utterson and Enfield saw in Dr. Jekyll. So we come into Chapter 8 then, and it's called The Last Night. So we would assume that this is the end of the story. But of course, we've got two more chapters after this. But just to give you a heads up that it's called The Last Night because this is the final part of the actual narrative in terms of the linear narrative, because the chapter ends in the death of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The final two chapters are the letters that were written to Utterson by Lanyon, only to be opened upon his death. So it's Lanyon's account of what happened, so it fills in some of the things that happened to him before he died. And then obviously the final one is given over to Dr. Jekyll for him to tell his full story right from the very beginning. So even though we're only at chapter 8 out of 10, the idea of it being the last night is because this is the last part of the actual the linear narrative that occurs. Okay. I'm only going to go through the first half of the chapter with you because it's quite a long chapter, and there's a lot to take in because obviously this is the culmination of the story. So I'm only going to read half of it to you, and then I'll do the next half next week. Okay. Find the right page there. The Last Night. Mr. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening after dinner when he was surprised to receive a visit from Paul. "Bless me, Paul, what brings you here?" he cried. And then, taking a second look at him, "What ails you?" he added. "Is the doctor ill?" "Mr. Utterson," said the man, "there is something wrong." "Take a seat, and here is a glass of wine for you," said the lawyer. "Now, take your time and tell me plainly what you want." Now, remember that Paul is butler to Dr. Jekyll. And even though he's a servant, he would actually be quite sort of, he'd be the highest member of the household, kind of like a PA. But even so, he's still an employee of Dr. Jekyll. So for an employee of a gentleman to go and visit another gentleman, Mr. Utterson, during the evening would be very, very unusual. There's something very kind of wrong about this in terms of the etiquette of the time, because as we know, class was a really big consideration of the time. So for Paul of working classes to go and visit Mr. Utterson, in what seems like a social call, because with Mr. Utterson being middle class or upper middle class, will be very, very out of place, very, very irregular. So that's why Utterson is a little bit shocked when he sees Paul there. So the fact that Paul has turned up on his doorstep suggests that there is something really quite significantly wrong that he's come to speak to Mr. Utterson about. Okay? You know the doctor's ways, sir, replied Paul, and how he shuts himself up. Well, he's shut up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it, Mr. Utterson, sir. I'm afraid. Now, my good man, said the lawyer, be explicit. What are you afraid of? I've been afraid for about a week, returned Paul, doggedly disregarding the question, and I can't bear it no more. The man's appearance amply bore out his words. His manner was altered for the worse, and except for the moment when he had first announced his terror, he had not once looked the lawyer in the face. Even now he sat with a glass of wine untasted on his knee, and his eyes directed to a corner of the floor. I can't bear it no more, he repeated. Now, even though Paul is of working class origins, he's still a man. And we talk quite a lot about gender in the book. And the fact that we have a man here who is repeating words like, I'm afraid, I've been afraid for about a week, I can't bear it no more. This will be really quite out of character for a man of the time to admit that he's frightened. And as I said, he's not, even though he's working class, he's high up in the working class, he's a very, very trusted employee of Dr. Jekyll. He effectively runs Dr. Jekyll's household for him. So for him to come to another man and admit that he's frightened suggests that there is something very, very amiss, very wrong here, and that he has genuine fears. And if you think as well, one of the big things of Victorian life that we talked about is the idea of a man's reputation. So for Paul to visit Utterson and potentially to jeopardise or to destroy or to harm Dr. Jekyll's reputation, Paul wouldn't have done this unless he had very, very serious concerns, very good reason to go and tell somebody out of the household about his concerns, okay? But as we know from what we've had dealings with Utterson before, he's a very trustworthy man, and right from the very start of the novel, we were told that he was a gentleman that was often there in the going down of a friend. So when a friend was really in the worst moments of their life, if they were perhaps involved in a scandal, he never gave up on people. And so for him now to be the person that Paul goes to get help with Jekyll is quite significant. It reminds us just how trusted and how trustworthy Mr. Utterson is. Come, said the lawyer. I see you have some good reason, Paul. I see there is something seriously amiss. Try to tell me what it is. Seriously amiss means very badly wrong, terribly wrong. I think there's been foul play, said Paul hoarsely. Foul play, cried the lawyer, a good deal frightened and rather inclined to be irritated in consequence. What foul play? What does the man mean? I daren't say, sir, was the answer, but will you come along with me and see for yourself? Now, foul play is an old-fashioned term that suggests that something terribly wrong has happened, and foul play normally means that a crime has been committed. So it's a term that wouldn't be used lightly, so it wouldn't be something that people would just throw around. So to say that you suspect foul play means that you suspect something illegal, and that's why Utterson is described as being concerned, but also a little bit irritated, because he maybe thinks that Paul is perhaps exaggerating, that he's making things up, that he's misinterpreting whatever it is that's going on. But either way, Mr. Utterson is concerned about it, but also maybe a little bit worrying that perhaps Paul is exaggerating what's happening. Mr. Utterson's only answer was to rise and get his hat and greatcoat, but he observed with wonder the greatness of the relief that appeared upon the butler's face, and perhaps with no less that the wine was still untasted when he set it down to follow. Now, the fact that the wine was untasted is important, because it shows that Paul hasn't been drinking, which means that Utterson is relieved that he can trust Paul's judgment in this whole thing, that he's perhaps not somebody that's used to making things up or lying about things. It was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March, with a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her, and a flying rack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. The wind made talking difficult and flecked the blood into the face. It seemed to have swept the streets unusually bare of passengers besides, for Mr. Utterson thought he had never seen that part of London so deserted. He could have wished it otherwise. Never in his life had he been conscious of so sharp a wish to see and touch his fellow creatures. For struggle as he might, there was borne in upon his mind a crushing anticipation of calamity. Now, there's a couple of things here. This idea of a crushing anticipation of calamity means that he's got this very innate feeling within him that something is terribly wrong. Calamity means something very, very bad is happening. And if it's this crushing anticipation, it means that his body is almost anticipating that there is something very, very bad that's happening, something quite dangerous that he's about to walk into. And as we know, Utterson is a man who's quite rational, he's quite he's not very emotional about things, but there is something within him that's telling him that this is a bad situation that he needs to be concerned about. Notice here as well the pathetic fallacy as he and Poole walk across London to Dr. Jekyll's house. It talks about the pale moon, it talks about the wind that made talking difficult and flecked the blood in the face. So the nature around is anticipating this growing sense of tension and something that's quite unpleasant, quite unusual that they're walking into. It's also worth noting as well the fact that it is completely empty, completely desolate around this part of London, which is normally quite popular. There's quite a lot of people around, and at this point, Utterson talks about this wish to see and touch his fellow creatures. So he feels quite isolated, and he almost has this wish that there were other people around, because he feels, for the first time, actually, we've seen Utterson feeling quite, I don't know, quite awkward, quite challenged by all this that's going on. But either way, he's having a very negative reaction to it, which is quite unusual for Utterson to admit. The square when they got there was all full of wind and dust, and the thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing. Poole, who had kept all the way a pace or two ahead, now pulled up in the middle of the pavement, and in spite of the biting weather, took off his hat and mopped his brow with a red pocket handkerchief. But for all the hurry of his coming, these were not the dews of exertion that he wiped away, but the moisture of some strangling anguish, for his face was white, and his voice, when he spoke, harsh and broken. Now, this point here, when it talks about him mopping his brow with a handkerchief, that's because he's sweating. But as Utterson notices, it's not a warm evening, or it's quite a cold evening, and it's not because they've been travelling quickly. He's sweating because it talks about it was the moisture, so the sweat of some strangling anguish. So, in other words, Poole is having a very negative physical reaction to what's going on because he's sweating, and this shows that this real growing feeling of tension and anguish and anxiety that he's experiencing here. The fact that his face is white and his voice was harsh and broken. We talked before about the fact that as humans we can't control physical reactions. If we're frightened, then our body takes on physical actions that we can't stop. So Poole, for all the fact that he's a man, he's a gentleman, he's supposed to be quite unafraid of things, quite brave about things, his body's telling him otherwise. His body's having a very strong physical reaction about the fact that they're heading back towards Dr. Jekyll's house and whatever it is that Poole knows is going on there. Well, sir, the lawyer said, here we are, and God grant there be nothing wrong. Amen, Poole, said the lawyer. Thereupon the servant knocked in a very guarded manner. The door was opened on the chain, and a voice asked from within, is that you, Poole? It's all right, said Poole, open the door. The hall, when they entered it, was brightly lighted up. The fire was built high, and about the earth the whole of the servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, the housemaid broke into hysterical whimpering, and the cook, crying out, bless God, it's Mr. Utterson, ran forward as if to take him in her arms. There's a couple of things here. As we've said before, we've talked about gender quite a lot, and it's a book that's very dominated by male characters because, of course, in the Victorian age, there was a very clear gender divide where the men were quite brave and bold and strong, and the women were quite weak and needed protecting. If you remember in chapter 4 with the murder of Danvers Carew, the first female that we saw in the book there was the maid who passed out at the site of the murder. And then here, once again, we see the housemaid and the cook who are described as hysterically whimpering and crying out, God bless, and running forward. So we see that the women here are they're having very exaggerated responses to what's going on. But even so, it's the male servants as well that are also upset about the situation. Notice as well, it talks about the hall when they entered was brightly lighted up. The fire was built high. Now, as I've said to you before, the fire was a significant symbol in Victorian literature in the sense that it was kind of the heart of the home and it represented light and warmth and positivity. So the fact that at the front of Dr. Jekyll house. We have the servants huddled around the fire for warmth and togetherness and safety. Because if you remember, the front of Dr. Jekyll's house represents Dr. Jekyll. This is where it represents hope and this very honest gentleman that we saw in the beginning of the book in Dr. Jekyll. And of course, it's the back of the house that represents Mr. Hyde. With it talks about the blistered paintwork and the dirty windows and the fact that the windows were high up so you couldn't see in, and the lock was rusted. So at the front of the house there is still an element of positivity, and this is where the servants are gathering. Okay. What are you all here? Said the lawyer peevishly. Very irregular, very unseemly. Your master would be far from pleased. They're all afraid, said Poole. Blank silence followed, no one protesting. Only the maid lifted up her voice and now wept loudly. Now, the fact that Utterson is annoyed with the servants because they're not doing their job. They should all, as servants, they should should be in the main part of the house unless they were working. But the fact that all of them are gathered in the centre of the house, which should only be for the people of the house, the owners of the house, as Utterson says, this is very irregular, and irregular means very wrong. And as he says, your master would be far from pleased. So Utterson tries at this point to kind of take on the role of the gentleman and sort of tell off the servants for not doing their job properly. But the fact that they are breaking their work code and they are in the centre of the house, which should just be where Utterson and guests and Dr. Jekyll are, suggests that this is something very unusual for them. And this is why they're all kind of huddled together around the fire for hope and warmth and togetherness. Hold your tongue, Poole said to her, with a ferocity of accent that testified to his own jangled nerves. And indeed, when the girl had so suddenly raised the note of her lamentation, they had all started and turned towards the inner door with faces of dreadful expectation. Where it talks about jangled nerves, that means that Poole's own nerves are very, very highly strung. So he's very really quite stressed and quite tense at this point. So his jangled nerves means that he shouts at the maid to stop crying because he's so tense himself, and it suggests that this tension is going through all of the servants. It's not just the women; it's everybody here that's feeling this level of tension. And now, continued the butler, addressing the knife boy, reach me a candle, and we'll get this through hands at once. And then he begged Mr. Utterson to follow him and led the way to the back garden. But at this point, they're leading the way through the back garden. So this is through the old dissecting surgery. If you remember, we've got this part that kind of like a garden, which would have been like a covered area where the operations would have taken place of one of the former owners of the house, who was a doctor of biology and anatomy rather than a chemical doctor, which Dr. Jekyll is. So we can see that they're making the transition from the warm, safe part of the house where there are other people to the back part of the house which we associate with Mr. Hyde. Now, sir, said the butler, you come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard. And see here, sir, if by any chance he will ask you in. Don't go. Mr. Utterson's nerves at this unlooked-for termination gave a jerk that nearly threw him off his balance. But he recollected his courage and followed the butler into the laboratory building and through the surgical theatre with its lumber of crates and bottles to the foot of the stair. So the stair that they're at the foot of, at the bottom of here, is the little flight of stairs that go up to the red baize door that goes into the cabinet at the back end of Dr. Jekyll's property, which is where the transformations always take place. Now, the fact that Utterson, it talks about his Utterson's nerves gave a jerk that nearly threw him off his balance. This is because Poole has just said to him that if the person behind the door asks you to go in, don't go. So we've got this real quite unusual kind of situation here, that Mr. Utterson is good friends with Dr. Jekyll, and yet his own butler here is saying don't go in, that there's a danger in there, and this is that unsettles Mr. Utterson very temporarily, but then he does get his courage back, as we would expect from a Victorian gentleman of this time. Here, Poole motioned him to stand on one side and listen, while he himself, setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call on his resolution, mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the red baize of the cabinet door. So we can see that Poole here, even though Poole is obviously very anxious and very tense about this and quite scared, he brings his resolution to the fore, and it's him that knocks on the door. Mr. Sir Utterson, sir, asking to see you, he called. And even as he did so, once more violently signed to the lawyer to give ear. To give ear means to listen. So he wants the lawyer to listen very carefully to the voice inside the door, but without Dr. Jekyll or whoever it is inside the cabinet hearing that Mr. Utterson is there. All right. So Paul is pretending to go on as normal, pretending that there's just a visitor at the door, just so that he can hear the person's voice behind the door, so that Utterson can hear who it is. A voice answered from within. "Tell him I cannot see anyone," it said complainingly. "Thank you, sir," said Paul, with a note of something like triumph in his voice. And taking up his candle, he led Mr. Utterson back across the yard and into the great kitchen, where the fire was out and the beetles were leaping on the floor. Now, when they go back into the kitchen, it's only a small point, but just note that it says that the fire was out. And if we think about the fire as being a symbol of hope, in the kitchen, it's the idea that the fire is out, therefore hope is starting to be lost. Okay? And when it says that Paul looked with a notice like triumph in his voice, that's because it's almost it's proven to Utterson what it was that Paul wanted to prove. And that is, as we see in a moment, that is that the voice of the person behind the other side of the door is not that of Dr. Jekyll. "Sir," the butler said, looking Mr. Utterson in the eyes, "was that my master's voice?" "It seemed much changed," replied the lawyer, very pale, but giving look for look. And the fact that Mr. Utterson is described as being pale is quite unusual for him, because he's normally quite strong and quite brave. So he himself realised that that is not the voice of Dr. Jekyll behind the door. And of course he grows pale here, and Poole is so concerned, because if that's not the voice of Dr. Jekyll behind the door, then who is it? Who's inside the cabinet? And most importantly, where is Dr. Jekyll? Where is he gone? "Changed? Well, yes, I think so," said the butler. "Have I been 20 years in this man's house to be deceived about his voice? No, sir. Master's made away with. He was made away with 8 days ago, when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. And who's in there instead of him, and why it stays there, is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson." Now, the term "made away with" generally means killed. He's been murdered. So Paul has this belief that whoever it is that's inside the cabinet has perhaps killed Dr. Jekyll. But the question is, why has the person the other side of the door stayed there? If they have done away, if they have made away or killed Dr. Jekyll, then why have they not disappeared? Why have they not fled themselves? Why are they still there in the cabinet? And this is why Paul is so concerned in the other staff, because they are assuming that the person on the other side of the door is perhaps a killer. It's a murderer of Dr. Jekyll. "This is a very strange tale, Paul. This is rather a wild tale, my man," said Mr. Utterson, biting his finger. "Suppose it were as you suppose. Supposing Dr. Jekyll to have been, well, murdered, what could induce the murderer to stay? That won't hold water. It doesn't command itself to reason." And at this point, we can see that Utterson is trying to be very rational and very logical. But it's quite bizarre, because I think he knows that there is something wrong, and he perhaps suspects it himself. But because at this moment in time, he is even though it's not his house that he's in Dr. Jekyll's house, he's perhaps the most senior person in that house, because he's a gentleman, because he's of the upper middle classes, he's a lawyer, he's friends to Dr. Jekyll himself. So he's having to take on the rational, logical point of view here, and sort of say, as he says here, what could induce? Induce means force. What could induce the murderer to stay? That won't hold water. And if something doesn't hold water, it means that it's not logical. It doesn't make sense. So we can see here that even though perhaps Utterson believes that something has happened, he's trying to be rational and to try and put the other point of view to Paul to keep things calm. "Well, Mr. Utterson, you are a hard man to satisfy, but I'll do it yet," said Paul. "All this last week, you must know, him or it or whatever it is that lives in that cabinet has been crying night and day for some sort of medicine, and cannot get it to his mind. It was sometimes his way, the master's that is, to write his orders on a sheet of paper and throw it on the stairs. We've had nothing else this week back, nothing but papers and a closed door, and the very meals left there to be smuggled in when nobody was looking. Well, sir, every day, aye, and twice and thrice in the same day, there have been orders and complaints, and I've been sent flying to all the wholesale chemists in town. Every time I brought the stuff back, there would be another paper telling me to return it, because it was not pure, and another order to a different firm. This drug is wanted bitter bad, sir, whatever for. So what's been happening here, Paul tells Utterson, is that for the last week or so, whoever it is that's inside the cabinet has not been opening the door, but they've been putting notes underneath the door, at the top of the steps for the servants to carry out their commands. And it seems that there is something that the person, whether it's Jekyll or Hyde or whoever it is that's inside the cabinet, something that they desperately need from a wholesale chemist, so from a pharmacist, really. And there is a certain drug that they keep asking for, and every time they go to a different chemist and bring it back, there's something wrong with it. Now, just to give you a little heads up here, we find out in chapter 10, in Dr. Jekyll's full confession, that the original transformations that took place involved a compound of various drugs. And it seems that in one of those drugs that he used, there must have been some kind of impurity. And he didn't realize that at the time, and he doesn't know what that impurity was, which means that now that he's having to make a fresh batch of the potion, it's not working. Because whatever it was that was the impurity, he can't get hold of that one particular variation of the drug again. That's why he's sending out these notes for his servants to go to various wholesale chemists across London to bring him back this drug and to see if it's the one that works. But it seems that none of them actually are. Now, of course, Utterson, Poole, nobody, the Victorian readers of the time wouldn't know this. We only know this because we know the story and because I'm telling you this now so you understand what's going on. But this is growing sense of desperation. Now, the desperation comes because if you remember in the early stage of the experimentation, Dr. Jekyll had to take the potion to become Hyde. But the more that Hyde, he turned into Hyde, the stronger that Hyde became, the stronger that 10% of evil within his brain became. He exercised that evil when he trampled over the girl, when he murdered Danvers Carew, whatever else he's been doing, which means that 10% evil within Jekyll has grown and grown and grown to the point that it's probably weighted more in the side of evil within his brain than it is good. So we now know that over time, that he starts turning into Dr. Jekyll without taking the potion. And we find out later on in chapter 10 that he spends his time as Mr. Hyde, and he only takes the potion to turn back into Dr. Jekyll. So that's where the balance in his brain is completely switched. And that's why whoever it is that's inside the cabinet, of course, we know that's Mr. Hyde. We know that he won't come out of the door. That's because he is in the body of Mr. Hyde for the entire time because he can't get any more of this drug that he needs, the impure drug, whatever it was that was in it, to make the potion to successfully change back into Dr. Jekyll. And that's why he's a very desperate man. Desperate, of course, because we know that if he's caught in this state as Mr. Hyde, the police will be involved and he will be executed for the murder of Danvers Carew. So that's why whoever it is, Mr. Hyde, of course, that's inside the cabinet, is desperate for this drug. He's not eating properly when the food is being left at the top of the stairs outside the cabinet door, and he won't be seen by any of his staff, and he won't talk to any of his staff other than through the door. And this is the account. This is what Poole tells Mr. Utterson has been happening for over a week now. When it talks about the papers just mean the notes, the little notes that Jekyll or Hyde or whoever has been writing and putting under the door for his staff to read. "Have you any of these papers?" asked Mr. Utterson. Poole felt in his pocket and handed out a crumpled note, which the lawyer, bending nearer to the candle, carefully examined. Its contents ran thus: "Dr. Jekyll presents his compliments to Mrs. Moore. He assures them that their last sample is impure and quite useless for his present purpose. In the year 18 Dr. J purchased a somewhat large quantity from Messrs. M. He now begs them to search with the most sedulous care, and should any of the same quality be left, to forward it to him at once. Expense is no consideration. The importance of this to Dr. J can hardly be exaggerated." So far, the letter had run composedly enough. That means quite calmly enough. But here, with a sudden splutter of the pen, the writer's emotion had broken loose. "For God's sake," he had added, "find me some of the old." So this little paragraph here, this is Mr. Utterson reading one of the notes that Dr. Jekyll had given to Poole to take to one of the wholesale chemists. And as we can see, he's saying to the people at the chemist that back in the year 18 blank, and of course it's 18 blank because Stevenson wants to create this air of mystery. Has it already happened? Is this going to happen? It puts the readers very much on edge, which is very typical of Gothic literature of the time. So at some point in whatever year, he purchased a quantity of this particular drug, and he needs some from the exact same batch once again. And if you look at the end of the note, when it says, "For God's sake, find me some of the old," that's when we can see whoever's written the note, perhaps Dr. Jekyll, when he was in one of his moments when he was transformed back into himself rather than Mr. Hyde, is becoming desperate. And the fact that he says, "For God's sake," we have to remember the religious context of this time, and the fact that he's kind of calling on God. He's getting desperate. He's calling on God. He's literally praying to God that the chemist can send him some of the original batch of this drug that he desperately needs for the transformation. "This is a strange note," said Mr. Utterson, and then sharply, "How do you come to have it open?" "The man at Mr. Moore's was made angry, sir," said Paul, "and he threw it back to me like so much dirt," returned the butler. "This is unquestionably the doctor's hand, do you know?" resumed the lawyer. Hand, of course, means handwriting, so Utterson is questioning whether or not this is definitely Dr. Jekyll's handwriting. "I thought it looked like it," said the servant, rather sulkily, and then with another voice, "But what matters hand of write?" he said. "I've seen him." "You've seen him?" repeated Mr. Utterson. "Well, that's it," said Paul. "It was this way." And the part that comes up now, this is where Paul recounts to Utterson when he saw this person, whoever it is that's in the cabinet, we know that it's Hyde, come out of the cabinet one day last week when he thought that nobody was around. "It was this way. I came suddenly into the theatre from the garden. It seems he'd slipped out to look for this drug or whatever it is. The cabinet door was open, and there he was at the far end of the room, digging among the crates. He looked up when I came in, gave a kind of cry, and whipped upstairs into the cabinet. It was but for 1 minute that I saw him, but the hair stood upon my head like quills, like porcupine spikes. So in other words, his hair's kind of stood up on end. So we've got another physical reaction here that we see when he saw whoever it was in the cabinet, which again is very typical of people's reaction to Mr. Hyde, because they always have this very overwhelming negative physical reaction when they see him. "Sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? If it was my master, why did he cry out like a rat and run from me? I've served him long enough, and then..." But the butler paused and passed his hand over his face. Now, if you look again at this account, when he talks about this person that he saw coming out of the cabinet one day last week, we've got words like he gave a kind of cry. So we've got this very animalistic kind of feeling again, which we've had all the time about Mr. Hyde. And when he talks about why had he a mask upon his face, this is evidence now from Poole to Utterson that whoever it is that's in the cabinet is not Dr. Jekyll. "These are all very strange circumstances," said Mr. Utterson, "but I think I begin to see daylight." In other words, he begins to see a reason, clarity. He begins to see a reasoning behind what's going on. "Your master, Poole, is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. Hence, for aught I know, the alteration of his voice. Hence the mask and his avoidance of his friends. Hence his eagerness to find this drug, by means of which the poor soul retains some hope of ultimate recovery. God grants that he be not deceived." Now, a malady is a French word meaning illness. So Mr. Utterson is trying to be very rational here, and he believes that Jekyll is ill, that he's got some illness that makes him look very, that alters his face, that's perhaps aged him, that's made his voice sound different. So it seems that Utterson here, once again, is trying to play the very rational, logical gentleman and try and find a reason for what's going on. And that's the explanation for the drug that he needs, because he believes that Jekyll is ill and that he needs the drug, whatever the drug is, to make him better. And we need to remember the book was written in the late 1800s, when there was very early what we call psychoanalysis, and that's the kind of the study of the human brain, and I suppose very early looking at mental illness. And there was quite an interest in this field of medicine, but there was nothing that was known about it. So this is what Utterson is saying here. He believes that there's some kind of mental illness that Dr. Jekyll perhaps is undergoing, that's made him physically transform, and that's why perhaps he won't see his friends, why voices change. "There is my explanation. It is sad enough, Poole, and appalling to consider, but it is plain and natural, hangs well together, and delivers us from all exorbitant alarms. This idea of it delivering them from exorbitant alarms means that it takes away any unnecessary alarm or concern that they might have for Dr. Jekyll's safety. "Sir," said the butler, turning to a sort of mottled pallor. Pallor just means colour, his facial colour. "That thing was not my master, and there's the truth. My master," and here Paul looked round him and began to whisper, "my master is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf." And once again, then we have this idea that Hyde is dwarfish, that he's small. And of course, that's because he's underdeveloped as a human compared to Dr. Jekyll. It's also interesting as well to note here that Paul must feel very, very, very firmly about this, because he dares to argue with Utterson, who's a gentleman. Utterson attempted to protest. "Oh, sir," cried Paul, "do you think I do not know my master after 20 years? Do you think I do not know where his head comes to in the cabinet door, where I saw him every morning of my life? No, sir, that thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll. God knows what it was, but it was never Dr. Jekyll. And it is the belief of my heart that there was murder done." "Paul," replied the lawyer, "if you say that, it will become my duty to make certain. Much as I desire to spare your master's feelings, much as I am puzzled about this note, which seems to prove him still to be alive, I shall consider it my duty to break in that door." Now, this is where things start to get serious, because as we've already talked about, we know very much about the reputation of a Victorian gentleman and how this was important to them to preserve their reputation. And Utterson almost wants things to kind of settle, to calm, but Poole is absolutely insistent that the person inside the cabinet is not Dr. Jekyll, because he's worked for him for over 20 years, and as he says, I know exactly where his head comes to in the doorway, and the person that was going into the doorway was nowhere near that height. So he's absolutely adamant that the person inside there is not and cannot be Dr. Jekyll, and that's why he's insistent that there's foul play, that there's murder that's taken place. And as Utterson says, if you insist on this, I have got to do something about it. And if he did something about it, and if something unusual to be found, that could have a huge impact on Dr. Jekyll's reputation. And that's why Utterson is a little bit reluctant to do anything about it. But look at Paul's reaction now. Paul is absolutely delighted that Utterson is prepared to do something about it. "Ah, Mr. Utterson, that's talking," cried the butler. "And now comes the second question," resumed the Utterson. "Who is going to do it?" "Why, you and me, sir," was the undaunted reply. "That is very well said," returned the lawyer, "and whatever comes of it, I shall make it my business to see you are no loser." So Utterson and Poole are going to break down the door to find out who it is that's inside there. And when Utterson says that I shall make it my business to see you are no loser, that means that he is assuring Poole that Poole, as the servant, will not get in trouble, that Utterson will take responsibility. The lawyer took that rude but weighty instrument into his hand. "Oh, no, sorry. There is an axe in the theatre," continued Poole, "and you might take the kitchen poker for yourself." A poker was a long, thin piece of metal that was used to move the coals around on a fire. So it's quite a big, long, heavy piece of metal. So one of them has an axe and one of them has the poker. The lawyer took that rude but weighty instrument into his hand, in other words, the poker, and balanced it. "Do you know, Poole," he said, looking up, "that you and I are about to place ourselves in a position of some peril?" Peril means danger. So at this point, Utterson is warning Poole that he's going to put himself in danger here. "You may say so, sir, indeed," returned the butler. "It is well, then, that we should be frank," said the other. Frank means honest with each other. "We both think more than we have said. Let us make a clean breast. This masked figure that you saw, did you recognise it?" Now, at this point, because Utterson realised that they're going into something potentially quite dangerous here, he's basically saying to Poole, "Be honest with me. Do you recognise this person?" Now, of course, they're both thinking it, but neither of them at this point are saying it, and they're both thinking that the person inside that cabinet is Hyde. "Well, sir, it went so quick, and the creature was so doubled up that I could hardly swear to it," was Poole's answer. "But if you mean, was it Mr. Hyde? Why, yes, I think it was. You see, it was much of the same bigness, and it had the same quick, light way with it. And then, who else could have got in by the laboratory door? You've not forgot, sir, that at the time of the murder he had still the key with him, and this is the key to the back entrance, if you remember, the back door where Utterson and Enfield walked on that first day. But that's not all. I don't know, Mr. Utterson, if you ever met this Mr. Hyde." "Yes," said the lawyer, "I once spoke with him." "Then you must know, as well as the rest of us, that there was something queer about that gentleman, something that gave a man a turn. I don't rightly know how to say it, sir, beyond this, that you felt it in your marrow, kind of cold and thin. Now the marrow is it's the stuff that kind of is inside your bones. So Poole here is saying that he felt it in his bones, something deep within him, that there's something very wrong about Mr. Hyde. So he's just kind of admitted that he's not absolutely certain that it was Hyde that's in the cabinet, but he's certainly enough to admit to us, and that's who he believes that it was in there. I own I felt something of what you describe, said Mr. Utterson. Quite so, sir, returned Poole. Well, when that masked thing, like a monkey, jumped from among the chemicals and whipped into the cabinet, it went down my spine like ice. Oh, I know it's not evidence, Mr. Utterson. I'm book-learned enough for that. Book-learned means intelligent. I'm book-learned enough for that. But a man has his feelings, and I give you my Bible word, it was Mr. Hyde. Now, this is Poole here was talking about when he saw whoever it was last week come out of the cabinet. And if you look, he refers to him as the masked thing like a monkey. Now, there's a slight hint here, reference here to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and the idea that mankind, according to Charles Darwin, evolved from monkeys, from apes. And it goes along this idea that only the evil people would have undergone the process of evolution, and that everybody else is made in God's image. And if you notice as well, Poole reiterates that when he talks about, I give you my Bible word. So he's swearing on God, by God, to this here. And it's only quite a short paragraph there, but it's quite an important one, because it shows the jar, the anxiety that was going on in the Victorian period between science and between religion, in the fact that religion was obviously saying that man was created by God in God's image, and that science and people like Charles Darwin, the early evolutionists, were saying that man evolved from the apes here. So that one little tiny paragraph there is actually quite important, quite significant. I, said the lawyer, my fears incline to the same point. Evil, I fear, founded, evil was sure to come. Evil was sure to come of that connection. Truly, I believe you. I believe that poor Harry is killed. Don't forget that Harry is bizarrely a nickname for Henry, so he believes as well that Henry's dead. So Utterson now is stopped trying to be rational, and he actually believes that foul play has taken place in that cabinet, that he has been murdered. And I believe his murderer, for what purpose God alone can tell, is still lurking in his victim's room. Well, let our name be vengeance. Call Bradshaw. Bradshaw the footman came at the summons, very white and nervous. Pull yourself together, Bradshaw, said the lawyer. This suspense, I know, is telling upon all of you, but it is now our intention to make an end of it. Paul here and I are going to force our way into the cabinet. If all is well, my shoulders are broad enough to bear the blame. In other words, if when they get in there, there's nothing the matter, there's no problem at all, then Utterson, his shoulders are broad enough to bear the blame. In other words, he will take sole responsibility for it. So we've now got the footman Bradshaw, who is there to help Utterson and Paul break into the cabinet. Meanwhile, lest anything should really be amiss, or any malefactors seek to escape by the back, you and the boy must go round the corner with a good pair of sticks and take your post at the laboratory door. We'll give you 10 minutes to get to your stations. So he gets Bradshaw and one of the young porters to go around out of the house, around the back with sticks, and they will go to the back door, which is, if you remember, is the other route, the back route into the laboratory, which is on the back street that Utterson and Enfield walk past. So they're preempting, they're considering whether the person in there might be able to get out the back door, and they're putting people in place at the back door in case he does try to do that. And they're giving him 10 minutes to get into position. As Bradshaw left, the lawyer looked at his watch. And now, Paul, let us get to ours, he said, and taking the poker under his arm, he led the way into the yard. The scud had banked over the moon. The scud just means the dark clouds. So the scud had banked over the moon, and it was now quite dark. The wind, which only broke in puffs and draughts into that deep well of building, tossed the light of the candle to and fro about their steps, until they came into the shelter of the theatre, where they sat down silently to wait. London hummed solemnly all around, but nearer at hand the stillness was only broken by the sound of a footfall moving to and fro along the cabinet floor. So we've had all this kind of talking and conversation and stress and anxiety, and then we've got this 10-minute pause while they wait for the two men to get to the back door, and it talks repeatedly about the darkness, about the stillness. And what Stevenson is doing here is he's lowering the tension here in order for it to go up again when they break down the door. And if you notice, the only sound are the footsteps of whoever it is inside the cabinet who's moving to and fro across the cabinet floor. So that's the only reminder of what they're about to do, the footsteps that are going backwards and forwards. And it's quite interesting to note that if we have somebody walking backwards and forwards, up and down, it suggests that they're quite tense, they're quite nervous. So whoever it is in the cabinet is obviously quite anxious about something. Now remember that the person inside the cabinet, whether that's Jekyll or Hyde or somebody else, does not know what's about to happen. They don't know that the door's about to be broken down. And so it will walk all day, sir, whispered Poole. Aye, and the better part of the night. Only when a new sample comes from the chemist, there's a bit of a break. Ah, it's an ill conscience that's such an enemy to rest. Ah, sir, there's blood foully shed in every step of it. But hark again, a little closer. Put your heart in your ears, Mr. Utterson, and tell me, is that the doctor's foot? And what Paul here is saying, he's talking about the footsteps that they can hear. And when he says it's an ill conscience that's such an enemy to rest, it means that if somebody's got has got something on their conscience, or they've done something wrong, if ill conscience, or ill meaning bad, it suggests that they can't rest, they can't settle. And that's quite true, because if you have done something quite bad or quite wicked, you're quite upset about it, then very often people can't sleep. And it's saying that night and day, Paul hears these footsteps going up and down in the cabinet. The steps fell lightly and oddly, with a certain swing, for all they went slowly. It was different indeed from the heavy creaking tread of Henry Jekyll. Utterson sighed. Is there never anything else? He asked. Poole nodded. Once, he said. Once. I heard it weeping. Weeping? How that? Said the lawyer, conscious of a sudden chill of horror. Weeping like a woman or a lost soul, said the butler. I came away with that upon my heart, that I could have wept too. Now that's quite significant, that the person inside the cabinet is weeping, is crying, and as Poole describes it as being as weeping like a woman or a lost soul. Now this idea of it being like a lost soul, this of course is what we know is what's happening to Dr. Jekyll, because he really has lost his soul. He's kind of sold his soul to the devil in trying to do this split personality, and the fact that he's weeping suggests that he's very, very upset about this, that he's very bereft, very empty about what he's done. And there's almost like a growing, perhaps, sympathy, I suppose, building for the person that's inside the cabinet, because they're not just somebody who's very dangerous and very unpleasant and shouting and growling, that they're crying. And if you think about the gender constructs of the time, we would not expect a gentleman, a brave, strong gentleman as Henry Jekyll, to be caught crying, to be seen, heard weeping. But now the 10 minutes drew to an end. Poole disinterred the axe from under a stack of packing straw. The candle was set upon the nearest table to light them to the attack, and they drew near with bated breath to where that patient foot was still going up and down in the quiet of the night. Jekyll, cried Utterson with a loud voice, I demand to see you. He paused a moment, but there came no reply. I give you fair warning. Our suspicions are aroused, and I must and shall see you, he resumed. If not by fair means, then by foul. If not of your consent, then by your brute force. At this point, Utterson reveals to whoever is in the cabinet, Jekyll or Hyde, whoever, that he's there, and he gives him fair warning. So he shouts out that he's there to give whoever's in the cabinet to actually open the door rather than have them knocking it down. Utterson, said the voice, for God's sake, have mercy. Ah, that's not Dr. Jekyll's voice. It's Hyde's, cried Utterson. Down with the door, Poole. So that end point there, which is halfway through where I'm going to pause it, it ends at quite a significant point, because this is where Mr. Utterson realises that the person's voice that's spoken to him is not Dr. Jekyll. It's in fact Mr. Hyde, and it's that causes Mr. Utterson to finally give the order to knock down the door. If you noticed the final words there, because they are actually the final words of Dr. Jekyll, the very last thing that he says is, for God's sake, have mercy. So we have a reference to God, and we have the reference to mercy, and pleading for mercy suggests that he wants forgiveness for something, but those are the last words that Dr. Jekyll speaks. Or Mr. Hyde, whoever he is at that point that speaks there. So I'm going to leave it just there, which is exactly 50 minutes, which is how long our lesson would have been. So all I want you to have done is to read through the chapter with me and to make any notes that you want to make. And then I'm going to set you one of the big A3 sheets that goes through that first half of the chapter. As I said, it is a long chapter, and then next week I'll look at the second half of the chapter with you, which is where the door is broken down and they see what's on the other side of the door. Okay,